The morning of December 19th, 1944, is so cold that the ink half freezes in his pen. Hauptmann Friedrich Sommer of the Second Panzer Division stands at the edge of a logging road in the Ardennes Forest. Binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching a column of American supply trucks burning on the road below. The offensive is 4 days old. It is working. The Americans are running. He lowers the binoculars and writes in the small leather diary he keeps inside his coat against his chest, where it stays warm. The Americans build beautiful machines and send boys to drive them. We send men. A factory cannot teach a boy to fight in the snow. Today I watched them run, and I understood finally that this war between the engineer and the soldier will be won by the soldier. He believes this completely. He has reason to. He has survived France, survived the long retreat, survived 3 years of being told by Berlin that German fighting spirit would always overcome material weakness. What Friedrich Sommer could not yet know, standing in that frozen forest, watching boys run from his guns, was that the burning trucks meant nothing. That 400 miles behind those boys sat a machine of organization so vast, so patient, so utterly indifferent to courage, that it had already calculated the date of his defeat. He was not fighting the men in front of him. He was fighting the men who had planned them. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain the difference to people who had never seen it. To understand what broke Friedrich Sommer, you must first understand the man who could not be broken by anything ordinary. He was born in 1912 in Marburg, a university town of stone bridges and steep streets in central Germany. His father taught mathematics at the gymnasium. His mother played piano. He grew up in the lean, humiliated Germany of the 1920s, a boy who watched his father carry a suitcase of banknotes to buy a single loaf of bread during the hyperinflation, and who absorbed, without ever being told directly, that the orderly world his parents believed in had failed them. He joined the army in 1933. By 1940, he was an Oberleutnant. By the time he stood in the Ardennes, he was a Hauptmann, a captain, 32 years old, commanding a company of panzers, with the Iron Cross First Class and a reputation among his men for calm under fire that bordered on the unnatural. He was not, by the standards of his time and place, a fanatic. His diaries contain almost no mention of ideology. He does not write about race, or destiny, or the 1,000-Year Reich. What he writes about, again and again, is competence. The thing he worshipped was skill, the well-laid ambush, the perfectly timed counterattack, the gunner who could hit a moving target at 1,200 meters. He believed that war rewarded mastery, and that German soldiers were masters, and that this, in the end, was all that mattered. In a letter home to his younger brother Karl, dated June 1944, he wrote, "You ask whether I am afraid of the Americans now that they have landed. I will tell you what I have seen of the Americans. They are generous with steel and stingy with thought. They attack on schedule, as if war were a railway timetable. A German lieutenant improvises. An American lieutenant consults a manual. When the manual has no answer, they wait for someone behind them to write a new page. We will not lose to such men. We may be buried under their machines, but we will not lose to them." There is a terrible irony folded inside that letter, and it would take Friedrich Sommer nearly a year and the destruction of almost everyone he knew to see it. He had identified the exact mechanism of his own defeat and mistaken it for weakness. The American who consulted the manual, the page being written behind the lines, the war run like a railway timetable. He was looking directly at the thing that would kill him, and he was laughing at it. The first crack came on a clear afternoon in late July 1944, in the bocage country south of St. L. The bocage was a landscape of small fields divided by ancient earthen hedgerows, some of them centuries old, packed solid with roots and topped with trees. It was perfect defensive ground. A single German machine gun crew, well sighted behind a hedge, could hold up an entire American company for hours. Sommer's division had been fighting in this country for weeks, and the Americans had been bleeding for every field. Sommer's diary from this period is almost cheerful. The Americans, he writes, are learning the oldest lesson of war, that ground must be paid for in blood, and that the Germans set the price. Then, on the afternoon of July 26th, something changed. He hears it before he sees it. Not the rhythm of an attack, the probing, the artillery, the infantry going to ground, but a single continuous roar that does not stop. He climbs to an observation post in the upper window of a farmhouse and looks north. And what he sees does not fit anything in his experience. The American tanks coming through the hedgerows are not going around the gaps. They are going through the hedges. Each tank has a strange arrangement of steel teeth welded to its front. And as he watches, a Sherman lowers its nose into a hedgerow that should have stopped it cold and tears straight through the embankment in a spray of earth and roots, emerging into the next field with its guns already firing. They have grown tusks, he writes that night. The tanks have grown tusks, and the hedges no longer hold them. What he was watching had a name, though he did not know it. The device was called a Cullen hedgerow cutter. It had been invented 3 weeks earlier, not by a general, not by a designer in a laboratory, but by an American sergeant named Curtis Cullen, who had welded scrap steel from German beach obstacles onto the front of his tank and demonstrated that it could plow through the bocage. The idea moved up the chain of command, reached General Omar Bradley, and within days, hundreds of tanks across the American First Army had been fitted with the cutters using salvaged German metal. Sommer saw the tusks. He did not see the sergeant. He did not see the chain of men who had taken one soldier's idea and turned it, in less than a month, into a weapon issued across an entire army. He recorded the result and missed the cause entirely. And so he filed the hedgerow cutters away in his mind as a clever trick, an anomaly, and went back to believing that the war would be decided by the men who held the ground. He was wrong, by a margin he could not yet measure. After St. L, the events began to stack, one atop another, until even a man as disciplined as Friedrich Sommer could no longer pretend they were unconnected. The pattern that emerged was not about any single weapon. It was about something stranger and harder to fight. The speed at which the Americans corrected their own mistakes. His diary entries through the autumn of 1944 read like the notes of a man slowly realizing he is in the wrong kind of fight. He records a captured American field manual, translated by his battalion's intelligence officer. He notes with grudging interest that it is not a manual of tactics, but a manual of replacement. Page after page on how to move fuel, how to repair engines in the field, how to route a damaged tank back to a depot and return it to the line in 72 hours. The numbers, when they reached him, were almost impossible to believe. By the autumn of 1944, the scale of American production had become a kind of physical fact on the battlefield, and the figures behind it were staggering. Over the course of the war, the United States produced more than 88,000 tanks and nearly 300,000 military aircraft. A volume of output that no other combatant came close to matching. American factories turned out a Sherman tank roughly every half hour at peak production. And the Ford plant at Willow Run was completing a 4-engine B-24 bomber, approximately every 63 minutes. Sommer did not have these exact figures. But he had something more immediate, the evidence in front of him. He writes, in October, of destroying 4 Sherman tanks in a single engagement near Aachen. A clean and brilliant ambush. The kind of action that would have crippled an attack earlier in the war. He writes of his satisfaction, and then, 2 days later, he writes a single line that marks the true beginning of his unraveling. We killed 4. This morning there are 9 where the 4 had been. I am beginning to feel that I am shoveling against the tide. His intelligence officer, an Oberleutnant named Brandt, put it more bleakly during an evening conversation that Sommer recorded almost word for word. Brandt said, "We are not fighting their army, Herr Hauptmann. Their army is just the part we can see. We are fighting their whole country, and their country is not tired." It was the truest thing anyone in that war ever said to him. And Sommer wrote it down, without yet understanding it. What the Germans were colliding with was not simply industrial volume. It was a system of planning that treated war as a problem of logistics and management rather than heroics. A system staffed not by famous generals, but by thousands of anonymous officers in supply depots, and planning sections, and statistical control offices. Men who counted, scheduled, and routed. The German army had built itself around the cult of the brilliant battlefield commander. The American army had built itself around the assumption that no single commander could be trusted to be brilliant, and had therefore engineered a machine that could win even when led by ordinary men. It was, in a sense, the difference between Sommer's father, the mathematics teacher who believed in order, and the Germany that had abandoned that order for the worship of will. Friedrich Sommer had spent his life believing that the soldier would always beat the engineer. By the end of 1944, he was watching the engineer bury the soldier, one replaceable tank at a time. The thing that finally broke him did not happen in a great battle. It happened on the night of December 26, 1944. In a field outside the Belgian town of Celles, at the absolute farthest point the German Ardennes offensive ever reached. The high watermark of the last great German attack of the war. By then, the offensive that had begun with such confidence 1 week earlier was dying. The thing that had killed it was not Allied courage, though there was courage. It was something Sommer could have predicted from his own diary if he had been willing to read it. The German tanks had run out of fuel. The entire offensive had been gambled on capturing American fuel dumps, because Germany no longer had enough of its own. And the Americans, with their endless capacity to count and plan, had simply moved the fuel out of reach and let the German tanks roll to a stop in the snow. Sommer's company had 4 panzers left. 3 of them were now immobile, drained dry, their crews huddled inside against the cold, waiting for fuel that would never come. He had spent the day watching American fighter bombers the skies had cleared, and the planes had returned in numbers that blotted the daylight work methodically along the stalled column, destroying the helpless tanks one by one. That night, he walked the length of the column on foot. And in the diary entry he wrote afterward the longest, and the last he would write with a steady hand, he describes what he found. I walked past the tank of Feldwebel Reinhardt. It had burned. The snow around it had melted in a perfect circle, and then frozen again, black and smooth as a mirror. Reinhardt was 19. His crew were younger. The hatch was open, and I did not look inside, but on the snow beside the track lay a single glove, a child's size almost, and a photograph, scorched at one edge, of a woman I did not recognize holding an infant. The fire had taken everything else. I stood there a long time. The artillery had stopped. There was no sound at all except the engines of the American aircraft, very far away, going home. And I understood, standing in that silence, that we had never had a chance. Not since 1941. We had been dead men walking for 3 years, and only our courage had kept us from noticing. The Americans did not hate us. That was the thing I could not bear. They did not hate us. They processed us. We were a problem of supply, and they had solved us the way a man solves an equation, without anger, and went home to sleep. That is the emotional center of everything Friedrich Sommer ever wrote. A burned glove. A photograph. The silence after the guns. And the unbearable realization that the enemy who was destroying his world felt nothing toward him at all. That he and everyone he loved were being erased not out of hatred, but out of arithmetic. He did not write in the diary again for 11 days. What was left of Sommer's division pulled back through the snow in the first weeks of January 1945. Abandoning vehicles it could no longer fuel. The great offensive collapsing into a retreat that would not truly stop until it reached the heart of Germany itself. The Ardennes offensive had cost the German army on the order of 80,000 to 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with the irreplaceable tanks and aircraft that Germany no longer had the industrial capacity to rebuild. The Americans suffered heavily as well, but the Americans could replace their losses, and the Germans could not. And that single fact contained the entire remaining story of the war. Sommer's diary from this period is fragmentary. He records the names of the dead as he learns of them. Brandt, the intelligence officer who had understood the war better than anyone, killed by a strafing aircraft near Hufeleis in January. Karl, his younger brother, the one to whom he had written so confidently about generous steel and stingy thought, killed in February on the Eastern Front. In a war Friedrich had stopped pretending Germany could win. He was captured by American forces in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, in one of the largest mass surrenders in military history, when more than 300,000 German troops were taken prisoner in a matter of days as their pocket of resistance simply collapsed. In his processing as a prisoner of war, he was interviewed by a young American officer whose job was to gather intelligence on German morale. The transcript of that interview survives. The American asked Sommer, almost casually, why he thought Germany had lost. And Sommer's recorded answer was this: "You ask me about your generals. I do not remember the names of your generals. I remember your clerks. Somewhere behind your lines there was a man with a list, and on his list was a number. And the number was the day we would lose. He was never wrong. I never saw his face. He was more dangerous than any soldier I ever met, and I think he went home every evening at a reasonable hour, and never once dreamed of us." The American officer noted in the margin of the transcript that the prisoner seemed calm and reflective, not hostile, and moved on to the next man in the line. He did not understand that he had just recorded one of the most precise descriptions of American military power ever spoken by an enemy. The clerk with the list. The man who was never wrong. Sommer had finally seen, too late, the thing he had laughed at in his letter to Karl. The page being written behind the lines. And recognized it for what it was. Not weakness. The deadliest weapon of the entire war. Friedrich Sommer survived. He was released from American captivity in 1947 and returned to Marburg, the university town of stone bridges, and found work, eventually, as a teacher of mathematics in the gymnasium where his father had taught before him. He married. He had 2 daughters. He did not, for most of his life, speak about the war. In 1979, an oral history project at a German university began recording interviews with surviving Wehrmacht veterans, and Sommer, by then an old man of 67, agreed to be recorded. The transcript runs to many pages. Near the end, the interviewer asked him the question that the American officer had asked him 34 years earlier. Why did Germany lose? His answer had not changed, but the old man had had 3 decades to find the words. We were raised to believe that war was a test of the soul, that the braver nation, the harder nation, the nation that wanted it more, would win. And we were brave. I want you to write that down. We were not cowards. Whatever else we were. But the Americans had understood something we refused to understand. They had understood that war is not a test of the soul. It is a test of the system. The bravest soldier in the world cannot fight without fuel, and fuel does not come from courage. It comes from a man at a desk who ordered it 3 months ago and routed it correctly. We worshipped the warrior. They perfected the quartermaster. And the quartermaster won. He will always win. I spent my whole life as a teacher trying to make young men understand this, and I do not think a single one of them ever believed me. Because they were young, and the young always believe that the soul is stronger than the system. God forgive us, we believed it too. He paused there, the interviewer noted, for a long time. And then he said one more thing. The cruelest part is that they were the better men for it. To plan instead of to boast. To count instead of to dream. It is not glamorous. It does not make songs. But it is, I think now, a kind of wisdom. Perhaps even a kind of decency. They did not love war the way we had been taught to love it. And because they did not love it, they ended it. We loved it, and it destroyed us. There is a lesson in that, but it is too large for me, and I am very tired. Friedrich Sommer died in Marburg in the spring of 1991, in the same town where he was born, 80 years old. A teacher of mathematics like his father before him. Among his effects, his daughters found the small leather diary he had carried against his chest through France, and the Ardennes, and the long retreat home. The final entry was not from the war. It was written in a shaking hand and dated only a few weeks before his death, as though he had taken the old diary out one last time to finish a thought he had carried for 46 years. I have thought all my life about the boy Reinhardt and the glove in the snow. I told myself for many years that he died for nothing. I do not believe that anymore. He died to teach me that there is no glory in the thing we served. Only the silence afterward, and the enemy going home, and the long work of becoming a man who counts before he kills. I was a good soldier. I wish someone had taught me, when I was young enough to learn it, to be something better than that. He had spent his youth certain that the soldier would always defeat the engineer, and he spent the rest of his life understanding that the engineer had never been his enemy at all. But the better angel of a thing he had been too proud, too young, and too well trained to recognize, until the snow had melted into a black mirror and frozen again around a 19-year-old boy. In the spring of 1945, as the German armies dissolved, the same American system that had counted its way to victory turned its attention to a new problem. And the men who had spent 4 years calculating how to destroy Germany sat down at their desks to calculate how to rebuild it.